Hey guys, I'm Christian, and this is Fed by Fire. So I took a week off, and I'm gonna share with you guys why, and we're also gonna talk about a lot of stories about what's going on in America. So what's been hitting me lately is realizing how many Americans are living inside systems that technically function on paper, but completely are disconnected from reality once you actually experience them firsthand. You know, because this month I had to find out, my Medicaid was gone, and I had been keeping up with it, not from a letter, not from a warning, not from somebody sitting down and explaining what happened. I found out because the doctor that does my injections called and said, you're no longer covered anymore. And that's how people find out life changing information now. And it's mid treatment, mid recovery, mid routine, but you gotta adapt. You're just trying to, hold your life together, and suddenly the system informs you that you've fallen out of the eligibility through an automated process that nobody fully understands. And according, to the numbers, the reason I lost coverage is because I make too much money. And, by that, they're talking about gross income, not what I take home. And that word gross alone explains half the problem in the country, because gross income is not reality. Gross income is accounting language. It's not what somebody actually survives on after taxes, child support, insurance deductions, gas, food, rent, and basic survival shit. But I'm just talking about the taxes. Realistically, I'm seeing, something, closer to not 18. So your exhaustion level, it doesn't calculate how expensive stability actually is, and it doesn't calculate recovery, stress, transportation, or whether somebody is barely staying afloat mentally. But it is what it is. It just reads the numbers. And what's crazy is this puts millions of Americans in the exact same trap, where you work just enough to lose assistance, but nowhere near enough to be comfortable and survive without it. So, the reward for improving your situation becomes increased instability. And, that's what people mean when they talk about the benefits cliff. You don't gradually transition into independence. The support just, disappears, while the financial reality underneath you hasn't actually changed enough to, compensate for it. And then, you have politicians, compensators sit around confused about why people feel hopeless, angry, addicted, burned out, or disconnected from society. But, I'm having a positive outlook. Constant instability, it changes people's psychology. And when every small improvement, risks creating a new emergency, your nervous system never actually relaxes. You stop planning long term because everything becomes short term damage control. And eventually, survival mode becomes basically your default operating condition. And that's why I keep saying, this isn't really about laziness. It's not even about individual failure. Most of the time, a lot of Americans are functioning inside systems that punish unstable people for being unstable, while simultaneously making stability extremely fragile. And once you start noticing the gap between paperwork and reality, you realize this dynamic exists far beyond healthcare and shifts into many more parts of life. More and more modern life feels like institutions interacting with abstractions of people instead of people themselves. And your data matters, more than your lived experience, apparently. Your profile matters more than your context. And the system it increasingly responds to patterns, indicators, keywords, proximity, metrics, categories, and risk models instead of people's individual human situation. And you can see the same shifts showing up in politics, law enforcement, surveillance, media, infrastructure, basically every major institution in our modern world. So now let's talk about the James Comey situation, because regardless of what somebody thinks politically, the weird part of this story I had to bring up is not even the indictment itself. It's the process required. He arranged some seashells on a beach, and got arrested for it. And let's talk about what stands out. So somebody saw the symbolism in the image, and somebody interpreted that as intent, and somebody escalated that interpretation into multiple layers of, institutions that had to decide what was going to happen. And once you really think about that, you realize something important has shifted culturally and legally. But at the end of the day, it's a picture of seashells, and the meaning itself has has raised a lot of questions. Not just actions, no direct statements, no interpretations, just a picture of some seashells. So the question increasingly becomes not what did you explicitly do, but what could you imply, or what might this encode, or how could this be interpreted inside a broader context. And to be clear, symbolic interpretation has always existed in law and politics to some extent. Courts look at intent all the time, but the difference now is scale and sensitivity. But Trump, I think he had it out for this Comey guy, because the Comey guy, is part of who got him indicted for the real estate charges. But, still at the end of the day, it's kind of crazy that he's getting arrested for a Facebook post. But language, symbolism, layered references, and the internet all combined, and you could find yourself in trouble, because that interpretation becomes operational. And once interpretation becomes operational, naturally systems start demanding more data, because data becomes the raw material for the contextualizing interpretation. And, that's where the geofence warrant conversation, what we're talking about next, becomes so important. Because on the surface, geofence warrants sound technical and boring, but most people hear about them. They've been all over the headlines lately and think it's just another legal argument over search procedures. But I want to talk about what this actually means. But the structural, they represent a massive shift in how investigations will function in the future. So traditionally, investigators identified a suspect first and then expanded outwards, gathering evidence connected to that person. These geofence warrants invert that logic. So now the system can begin by collecting, your location data from every one of your devices present near a crime scene during, a certain time frame, and work backward from there, narrowing down potential suspects. And that means that people will become part of, investigations, not necessarily because there's evidence against them, but, because their device occupied physical space somewhere that was relevant at the time. And, once that becomes normalized in public spaces, it's going to change everything conceptually, because now movement creates searchable historical records by default. And your phone, it becomes less like a personal device and more like an involuntary logging mechanism attached to, your existence. And, what's fascinating is how normalized this process already feels culturally. How most people barely react anymore, because surveillance now arrives wrapped inside of convenience. Navigation apps, smart devices, fitness trackers, digital payments, cloud backups. It's all around us. You can't escape it. Facial recognition, social media metadata, location history, license plate readers, the whole nine. The infrastructure of modern life continuously generates behavioral information automatically. And, none of it feels dramatic individually because no single technological step feels like the moment privacy disappeared. It's gradual. Instead, it happens, in little increments through accumulation. And that's the real pattern underneath a lot of these stories. Modern systems don't expand power through giant visible transformations anymore. They expand through constant integration. And one capability gets added here and one database gets connected there. One legal, representation broadens access somewhere else, and one emergency justifies another layer of monitoring. And, every individual piece sounds reasonable in isolation. But once you stack them all together, over years, the environment changes fundamentally everything. And, you can see the same thing happening in other spaces like cybersecurity and infrastructure. Look at the Iranian-linked cyber incidents that are involving industrial systems like utilities, pipelines, water facilities, and even energy infrastructure. What's interesting isn't just the attacks themselves, it's the language, that's used around them. So, the reporting is always extremely controlled and procedural. Operations were impacted systems were, temporarily disrupted facilities. They were shifted into manual operation services. They were all restored, but underneath that calm language, what's actually happening is critical infrastructure briefly losing automated control. And the reason that matters is because it changes the definition of stability itself for all of us. There was a time when infrastructure was considered stable because, interference was rare for us. Now, infrastructure is considered stable if it can recover quickly after interference. And that's a completely different psychological and technological baseline. So cyber intrusion stops being treated as an extraordinary event and starts becoming treated more like weather, a recurring condition systems, that are expected to just absorb data, and that changes institutional behavior all around. And once disruption becomes normalized, resilience becomes more important than prevention. And that means that there will be more monitoring, more redundance, more data integration, more predictive systems, more automated oversight on all of us. And again, every step gets framed as, modernization or security enhancement instead of expansions of institution into AI visibility into our lives. And the framing matters because the language determines how people emotionally process this change. If something gets described as, infrastructure improvement, then it's likely to get passed, and people stop questioning whether the infrastructure itself should exist in that form. And, so we're going to talk about that. And, so reportedly there was this boat with the Hansa virus on it, and those people have been dropped everywhere. And let's see what happens with that if it's a new COVID. There's a lot we could cover, but that's all for tonight, guys. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Peace.